Well, you can ask them. But they're going to say they're going to pay a fee now, right? They can. It's an option. Okay. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our Land Use Committee meeting of July 9th, 2018. I'm Katie Tang, chair of this committee. To my right is Vice Chair Supervisor Jane Kim, and we'd like to wish her a very happy birthday today and thank her for joining us despite it being her birthday. And we have Supervisor Asha Safai as well. Our clerk is Erica Major. From SFGov TV, we'd like to thank Samuel Williams and Michael Baltazar. And Madam Clerk, are there any announcements?
Yes, please make sure to silence all cell phones and electronic devices. Completed speaker cards and any copies of documents, any speaker cards and copies of any documents to be included as part of a file should be submitted to the clerk. Items acted upon today will appear on the July 17th Board of Supervisors agenda unless otherwise stated.
Thank you very much. And I'll make this announcement again later in the meeting, but I just wanted to put up front that we will be continuing items 6 through 8 related to Central Soma. It was just heard, or the bulk of it was heard at Rules Committee today, and so we are planning to have that kicked over to Land Use Committee for next Monday. So we will be continuing items 6 through 8 later in the agenda. Madam Clerk, can you please call item 1?
Yes, item number 1 is an ordinance amending the planning code to streamline affordable housing project review to provide for planning department review of large projects located in C3 districts and for certain minor alterations and affirming appropriate findings.
Thank you very much. And with that, I could either turn it to Supervisor Kim or Kanishka Chang. Maybe Supervisor Kim.
Well, I'm just going to be making a motion to continue this item to the call of the chair after public comment, but we don't have, conversations are ensuing between parties to work this out, and so we want to give all the stakeholders additional time, and I don't know if Ms. Chang would like to add anything to that or not.
No, I think that covers it. We're working on it. Thank you.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
So with that, we'll open up item 1 to public comment. Any members of the public wish to speak? Okay, seeing none, public comment is closed. Okay, all right. Colleagues, without objection, I'm going to reopen public comment for item 1. Please come on up.
Going to get my Medicare next week, so that's a sign of I really do need my Medicare. I just want to reiterate about Section 311 as it currently stands, that the 30-day notice period for the plans, the alteration plans, demolitions, new construction, anything that's currently covered under 311 by the 30-day notice should continue as it is, and that plans should be mailed to residents, neighbors. Particularly, it's most important for the adjacent neighbors to see those plans early on in the process. And that's basically what I want to reiterate. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any other members of the public who wish to comment on item 1? Okay, seeing none, public comment is closed. Can we get a motion on item 1?
Make a motion to continue to the call of the chair.
Okay, so moved, and we'll do that without objection. All right, item 2, please.
Item number 2 is an ordinance amending the planning code to authorize the zoning administrator to waive or modify bicycle parking requirements for an accessory dwelling unit and making appropriate findings.
Thank you very much, and I will call up planning staff in a moment, but just by way of background, I know there has been a lot of talk about accessory dwelling units and modifications to the planning code around that. Over the years, our office has especially felt that ADUs has been a great way to try to add more affordable housing in our city's housing stock. The most, again, affordable, should be the easiest, but over the years, since the legalization program has taken place, we have found and heard that many project sponsors are either hesitant to either create or legalize existing accessory dwelling units, or there are hiccups that they encounter over the process as they are in the process of legalization. And so after listening to many different people and groups in terms of what sort of challenges that they have encountered, planning staff work with Menika Mohan from my office to develop legislation around accessory dwelling units. And I want to thank Menika as well as Kimia Haradan and Marcel Boudreau from the planning department for their work on this. But over the course of time, we have tried to identify what those barriers are, and what you have before you today is legislation that again seeks to ease the process for creation of accessory dwelling units. Some of it also had to do with the mayor's process improvements legislation, and we'll speak to that a little bit later. But today, we actually do have a number of amendments that we're going to propose for the legislation. But first, before I walk through all the different amendments, perhaps what I can do is just bring up planning staff, Kimia, first, and we can talk through the basic components.
Good afternoon, Chair Tang and members of the committee. Kimia Haradan, Planning Department staff. The Planning Commission heard this item on June 21st, and they approved the proposed amendments with some modifications. There are 7 of them. I'm going to go through them one by one. So first is to allow expansion of ADUs within the buildable envelope. Currently, for most of the ADUs have to be within the existing built envelope. This recommendation would allow expansion within the buildable envelope. The second amendment is it's a code clarification amendment. It's related to an existing amendment in the ordinance that would allow expansion for ADUs under cantilever rooms and decks in the required rear yard without neighbor notification. The proposed modification is to just amend another section of the code, which is section 136C, to list filling under these spaces also in that code section as permitted obstructions. Number 3 is about corner lots. So the modification would allow that on a corner lot to allow a 1-story expansion of existing standalone garage structures limited to existing footprint. This was added to the ordinance per Supervisor Tang's request, and planning staff made that recommendation, and the Planning Commission approved that recommendation as well. Number 4 is to clarify that, is again another clarification item, to clarify that the provision to allow dormers when converting existing standalone garages or structures to ADUs would allow such expansions even if those structures are in the required rear yard. Number 5 is about street tree requirements. And it's to allow ADUs to pay into an in lieu fee for street tree requirements and apply the same provisions for unauthorized units undergoing legalization. Number 6 is something that the Planning Commission discussed to consider size thresholds for ADUs so that these units remain accessory. And number 7 is a recommendation with regard to the legalization program, and it's to remove an existing eviction loophole that exists in the legalization program. Recommendation is to remove the prohibition to use the legalization program where no-fault evictions have occurred, and amend the planning code and the rent ordinance to first clarify that the existing 5-year price control applies to no-fault evictions in unauthorized units, and 2 is to require the unit to be offered to previous tenants evicted, similar to provisions for capital improvements and owner-moving evictions that exist. That concludes all the recommended modifications from the Planning Commission. I'm here for any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you again for all of your work on this. So I just wanted to summarize what the original proposed legislation was and what amendments I'll be proposing today. You just heard what the Planning Commission recommendations were, and some of the recommendations we're taking and some not. So I'm going to go off the order of the summary sheet I provided to colleagues. But number 1, our legislation had proposed to eliminate the street tree requirement to speed up the approval process for ADUs. And the reason why was because we heard from a lot of project sponsors that they had trouble obtaining the Bureau of Urban Forestry person's time to be able to come out to site the tree. And so, but we also heard that, of course, our city, we want to plant more trees. And so the amendment that I'm going to propose today is to allow project sponsors to pay an in lieu fee for the trees instead, so that it will still go into a fee that will fund trees being planted in general in our city. Secondly, we're not changing anything about this, but we had in the legislation allowed for a zoning administrator waiver to permit the installation of a window facing an open area that is at least 225 square feet, with no horizontal direction being less than 9 feet. So again, this is getting a little detailed here, but that's something that's in the original legislation. And basically the reason for that was because it's been a common issue where project sponsors can't meet the 15 by 15 exposure requirement for ADUs. So we're giving a little bit more flexibility on exposure there. Item 3 is related to bicycle parking. We also heard from project sponsors that there had been difficulties meeting this bike parking requirement, and so we're allowing the building with no new corridors to use an existing 3-foot corridor and allow vertical bike parking to satisfy the bicycle parking requirement. Item 4, the fourth component of our legislation is to allow the addition of dormers, and if you need a picture, we have it in our handout, or if planning staff want to put it on the overhead, but there's a very specific definition for dormer windows, but we're allowing the addition of dormers when an existing standalone structure or garage is converted to an ADU without neighborhood notification, even if the dormer extends into the required rear yard. And so what we're doing in an amendment today in land use is I'd like to clarify that the provision to allow dormers when converting existing standalone garages or structures to ADUs would allow such expansion even if those structures are in the required rear yard. And so the definition for dormers is, again, very specific. I think it's, 8 by 8 or something like that. Planning staff can correct me if I'm wrong. And there are other requirements not related to this legislation that they would have to meet. Another component of our legislation is that we allow the expansion of ADUs under cantilevered rooms and decks in the rear yard without neighborhood notification. Now, this was in the original piece of legislation, but what I'm proposing today in land use is a mandatory pre-app meeting for the adjacent neighbors. We do know that and have heard a lot of concerns around eliminating the neighborhood notification requirements. So today we're going to again propose an amendment for a mandatory pre-app meeting if you are creating an ADU under a cantilevered room and deck or deck. We are also amending the planning code to list, so basically to allow the filling in under a cantilevered room or a deck as a permitted obstruction when adding an ADU, because currently it is not an allowed obstruction. We are also just doing one amendment to ensure that single-family homes maintain a rear yard lot depth of 25%, but no less than 15 feet. Most of our legislation really pertains to ADUs for multi-unit buildings, but we wanted to make sure that there's still a rear yard for single-family homes. Another component of our legislation was originally to allow more than one unauthorized unit to be permitted if it meets code requirements. And so that's something that is still going to remain in our legislation. Item 7 is that we are codifying an existing interpretation for the conditional use requirement for unauthorized units that cannot be legalized. There are some cases where the planning code doesn't provide a path to legalization, such as in areas that don't permit residential uses. And so the zoning administrators determined that if a unit cannot be legalized under the planning code, then it may be removed administratively, as the planning commission could not require that the owner legalize a unit if it's not permitted under the planning code. So basically, we just want to codify something that's been an existing practice. Number 8, regarding corner lots, we wanted to be able to allow up to 1-story expansion of an existing legal non-conforming structure. So again, it may be more helpful to see a visual of this, but this is something that we are taking a planning commission recommendation for. Item 9. As you just heard, we're allowing the expansion of ADUs within the buildable envelope. That is something that will be an amendment that I plan on making today based on the Planning Commission recommendation. The 10th item is that we are requiring in our legislation that planning department, fire department, and building department be present in pre-application meetings with project sponsors for ADUs. We heard often that a lot of project sponsors had to go back and forth between architects, between different departments to figure out what it is that they actually need to do to meet whether it was building code requirements or so forth. And so we wanted to make sure that all parties were there in the same room when a project sponsor is first even thinking about creating an ADU. However, we do have to have, just as a technical matter, we have to have our building code amendments to this trail, our land use committee, because that's where this language is housed. Originally, we had proposed to allow one ADU in a newly built residential structure of 3 units or less, so allowing an ADU in new construction, but we are actually going to remove this provision as part of our legislation because we heard a lot of concerns from the Planning Commission hearing about adding new ADUs as part of new construction. So I apologize that this was a lot that we just went through, but that is in summary an overview of the legislation as well as the amendments that I'll be proposing today. A couple things that we are not taking today include the Planning Commission's recommendation regarding legalization of units when there was a prior eviction. The reason why we're not doing that today is that is in the admin code. That is something we'll certainly consider at future date, but today we're just interested in making changes to the planning code. And then also, we are not taking a recommendation regarding a size threshold for ADUs because that would mostly apply to new construction. And given that today I'm making an amendment to remove the provision around new construction, that's also an amendment that I'm not planning on taking today. So with that said, those are all the legislative changes, but I do know that my staff, Menika Mohan, as well as planning, DBI, fire, and so forth, have been embarking upon multiple meetings in terms of ADUs and trying to make that process a lot more smooth for project sponsors. So I want to thank them for that ongoing work that you will not see on this paper. And then with that said, I also wanted to see if Marcel wanted to come up to talk about a new process at planning regarding if ADUs are created and they result in either parking or storage or laundry removal. I know that that has been a concern that was raised. So if you could speak to what the new process is in planning, that would be great.
Sure. Thank you, Supervisor. Marcel Boudreau, Department Staff. And I'll briefly just give you a overview on this process. Currently at DBI, they require a screening form, which precedes the ability to file a permit for ADUs. Working with DBI and planning, we have established a new procedure that requires an owner affidavit that requires the owner to acknowledge the existence of housing services as defined by the rent ordinance in San Francisco, and that the removal of that requires a just cause. And if the project to add the ADUs would potentially remove said housing services, then there is a notification requirement to tenants in the building. And part of the procedure of filing this new screening form would be to submit this information as well as the owner signing this affidavit. This has been implemented starting July 2nd for all new permits to be filed, and planning is working with sponsors and owners to retroactively update existing permits under review. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. I'm glad that we have this in place now. So that's a summary. And if colleagues have any questions, or we can go to public comment first before you. Okay. Oh, and yes, Kimia.
I just wanted to I have one question for the mandatory pre-application notice that you mentioned. That's only for infilling under cantilever rooms when they're in the required rear yard, correct?
Yes. Thank you for that clarification. Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, so with that, we're going to open up item 2 to public comment then. I have Georgia Schudish, Michael Murphy, Jeremy Schaub, George Wooding, Rose Hilson, Anastasia Yevnopoulos, and Ozzy Rum, if you want to come on up.
Good afternoon. I gave a handout to Ms. Major, and can read it. I mean, a lot of the things you mentioned, you've covered. I think just to say, you know, accessory dwelling unit also could stand for affordable dwelling unit. And that's the real concept of this. And that's why a minimum or to maximum size makes a certain amount of sense. I understand what you did not doing it in the new construction, and I'm glad you did that. I don't know if the word proposed is still in there, if that's a problem, if that needs a definition. But anything that involves a demolition should really be looked at very closely. This is going to sound a little crazy, but when people add an ADU, and I've seen this a lot when second units are added, they sometimes put a refrigerator in that doesn't have a freezer. They put a wine refrigerator in a second unit. I don't see how anyone could have a refrigerator, even with a teeny freezer, for ice cubes or ice cream. And I guess my point is that people put these very minimal refrigerators in, or wine refrigerators in, and the so-called second unit never hits the market. So, and they get their certificate of occupancy with a wine refrigerator. And I think it's a little loophole. I don't know if you can do that, it be that persnickety and that precise in your ordinance, but it is something to think about in terms of what kind of kitchen you have in these ADUs. And I do hope that at some point you will consider a minimum and maximum size because of the affordability issue. Thank you very much.
Hello, my name is Michael Murphy. I'm a resident of the Richmond District and a retired judicial attorney for the Court of Appeal, First District. While there's much to like in this ordinance, it has one significant omission. It fails to bring the San Francisco ordinance in compliance with state law regulating ADUs for single-family homes. 3 years ago, when the Planning Commission produced an ADU manual, the options for ADUs in single-family homes were limited and generally unattractive. The following year, the California legislature enacted legislation mandating a much wider range of practical options. Sadly, San Francisco failed to comply with state law. Ordinance 95-17 announced the purpose of complying with state law, but in fact made no meaningful concession to the law. The ADU manual was not revised. I must call your attention to the fact that the city attorney put its stamp of approval on Ordinance 95-17. I have sent to you a memo by way of an email before this meeting, showing that the ordinance is in fact widely in conflict with state law. Now, amending the San Francisco ordinance to comply with state law is only a first step, but the city attorney's position on Ordinance 95-17 unfortunately bars the way to taking this first step toward an effective ADU ordinance and manual. As a lawyer, I would hope that this problem could be resolved by amicable discussion, and the city attorney will participate actively in drafting an ordinance and manual complying with this very beneficial state law.
Hi. Good afternoon. I'm Dylan Casey with the California Renters Legal Advocacy and Education Fund. And I think this proposed ordinance takes a lot of steps in the right direction. But I want to talk here just to highlight 3 points where I think that San Francisco is still falling short of the required state standards for ADUs. First, San Francisco is required to allow one accessory dwelling unit in conjunction with a proposed single-family home. This change went into effect, I think, in 2017 at the state level. And so my understanding is that this will be amended, the San Francisco ordinance will be amended to prohibit ADUs in new construction, and I'm asking that that not happen. Second, San Francisco applies community notification and discretionary review to ADUs that expand the envelope of existing single-family homes. I believe this is also contrary to state law standards, which require ministerial review processes. So I would ask that the ordinance be amended to exempt ADU applications from discretionary review and community notification. Lastly, the way that San Francisco applies the open space requirements to new ADU applications, I think, is also contrary to state law. Open space requirements aren't listed as permitted regulations under state law, and they're applied independently. Or San Francisco applies a separate requirement for the ADU in the single-family home, and I think there should only be one requirement for the single-family home. I hope the board will consider making a few more amendments to this to bring San Francisco's laws in compliance with state law, and I'm going to submit some more detailed written comments that explain my positions. Thank you.
Good afternoon, supervisors. George Wooding, president of the Coalition for San Francisco Neighborhoods. Heretofore, ADUs that remain inside the footprint of a house did not require notification. Supervisor Tang's new ADU legislation will allow ADUs that are outside the footprint of a house to require no neighborhood notification. Additionally, a zoning administrator will be able to add a second ADU with no oversight. Bay windows, the elimination of side setbacks, de facto pop-outs that override the current 3-foot maximum, the conversion of freestanding garages and sheds into ADUs. Overall loss of design standards, when left to subjective criteria such as undefined design standards that the planning department would apply, which are not adopted design guidelines, anything will happen and probably will happen. I believe we should, number one, retain the existing code requirements for front obstructions. Number two, retain the existing code requirements for rear obstructions. Keep side setback areas as is. And number four, if square footage is added by projections with no maximums, it should be included to have an accurate quantification of building square footage. If the current design standards are not adequate, the new ones should be created with meaningful public input and review. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Jeremy Schaub of Schaub Lee Architects. First, I want to commend the three of you for working to help create more units throughout our city. I think at the end of this, we need to focus on that's our goal here. So I'd really like to emphasize that the idea of adding an ADU in new construction should be the right way to go. I know there was some consideration at the Planning Commission, but that all revolved around demolition. We can do ADUs in new construction if there isn't a demo. I have a lot of projects on vacant lots where we could put in more units. I have got about a dozen that I could think of just off the top of my head right now. So I think that's something we could focus on, an amendment to the legislation. And the one other piece is wanted to say that having a pre-application meeting with planning and building and fire is going to be very important to make sure we have all of our code issues nailed down ahead of time, because yeah, as you can see, we're trying to retroactively fix a lot of things. Like, who knew that street tree would stop prevention of construction? But that's where we're at. So I think pre-application is the way to go. Thanks.
Hello. My name is Victoria Fierce. I'm one of the co-executive directors of California Renters Legal Education Advocacy Fund. Dylan, our associate who is up here, is the director of the ADUs, also said similar things about the noticing requirements. And I'm here to pile onto that and also make it clear that it is a violation of state law. San Francisco would be out of compliance if it does not allow for ADUs to be built as part of new construction of single-family homes. The state law provisions that require that says that the entire ordinance would therefore be null and void. So it would default back to state law, and it'd be really disappointing to see the city of San Francisco spend all this time, energy, and money on developing this ordinance, only for it to just go to waste, because you didn't follow the rules. So, Carla, we sue cities who are in violation of housing law, and San Francisco might be coming up next if this isn't resolved. It'd be really great if San Francisco fixed this because, as we all know, we're in an affordable housing shortage, and accessory dwelling units are an amazing way for people to add a little bit of housing to their backyards, for their grandparents, for their kids, their families, small family expansions. It's almost certainly not going to be massive, big developers looking to make a quick buck on this. This is somebody who's looking for housing, looking to provide housing, looking to make a dent in our housing shortage. It's absolutely crucial, again, that San Francisco brings this ordinance into compliance with state law. So please do that. Do not pass this as it is tonight. Otherwise, there will be serious repercussions. And Carla's nice. There might not be nice actors out there. I just want to make sure San Francisco is safe. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Brett Gladstone. I'm a land use attorney in the city, and I've worked on a number of ADUs. First of all, thank you very much for working on this. The amendments are very necessary. I, too, believe you should check with the city attorney about whether it's compliant with state law to not allow ADUs for a single-family home. And I think the demolition concerns of the commission can be taken care of. Second, I think it's important for the public to know why the amendment, which I support, is occurring, that you can, in fact, do an ADU even though there's been an eviction in the prior 3 years. As it is currently, there's an incentive for owners to evict people when they don't want to legalize a unit, because the current law says that you cannot do a legalization of a unit if there's been an eviction during the prior years. So your legislation quite properly takes away that incentive for people to evict in order to get around the requirement that they legalize an illegal unit. I do share the concern that the building department is not as up to speed as planning on what it means to have no path to legalization. So I wanted to make sure your legislation includes a pre-application not just with the neighbors, but a pre-application with the building department, fire department, and the planning department. Finally, I support the idea that there can be additional waivers for open space. I've recently had an ADU case where the ADU process was not useful to a client because in addition to going through the ADU process, he had to get a variance because there was insufficient open space, and that is a very good amendment. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. Teresa Flandrick with Senior and Disability Action. I am very happy to hear of some of these amendments, Supervisor Tang, and I'm glad that you also obviously read the letter from the tenants union. Again, the difference in single-family homes, usually it's the owner that's there, and so they are very aware of they don't want delays, and they would be the ones inconvenienced, and they can be on top of monitoring things, whereas in multi-unit buildings, that's not the case, right? If there are existing tenants, it's those tenants who are oftentimes dealing with the loss of laundry facilities, et cetera, and not knowing their rights, rather. So as those of us on the ground advocating for tenants, I'm really wanting to push that all safeguards are in place before this goes into effect. As well as an affidavit, I would also suggest there be a copy of the buyout of the laundry, the storage, or the garage space that had been part of the services in tenants' contracts. And so having a copy of that buyout filed with the rent board means that that proof is there and that that has actually been filed. I would also like to suggest that there be a definite size range so that if it's a space of 1,400 square feet, that not a large flat be built, rather that a space where you could actually fit in 2 ADUs would be great. Again, my understanding of ADUs in terms of in-laws, grannies, whatever the name is they're usually between 300 and 700 square foot. So to really take advantage of ADUs adding affordable housing, I do think we need to put a specific range in place. Thank you very much.
Good day. I'm Anastasia Yovanopoulos, a District 8 tenant. I'm glad Supervisor Tang announced that adding an ADU as a component of new construction wouldn't be part of this ordinance. After all, ADU legislation's original intent is to construct units that are rent-controlled and affordable by design from already existing unused spaces at a property to add to our city's housing stock. I'm hopeful you'll decide to limit the size of ADUs to 1,200 square feet. Supervisors, I'm not comfortable about exempting neighborhood notification to allow ADUs to expand within the buildable envelope. Issues come up during construction that affect surrounding neighbors, and there could be unintended negative consequences without the option of public review in advance of a project moving forwards. Depending on property owners' truthful disclosures, tenants may or may not receive information regarding the addition of ADUs where they live, and as it stands, although the planning department is now invited to participate with DBI and the property owner in an optional pre-app meeting, the tenants are not participants. Wouldn't it make sense for tenants to be involved before the ADUs get permitted, especially if their laundry facilities, garage, and storage spaces in their rental agreements would be incorporated into the design of proposed ADUs, or if they have to vacate their units during the construction? The tenant protections proposed in legalization of illegal units in this ordinance doesn't deal with how long tenants will be displaced while their homes are legalized, and the financial compensation to the tenants is unrealistic. In addition, the zoning administrator must not allow more than one unit at a property to be legalized. Thanks.
Good afternoon, Supervisors. Corey Smith on behalf of the San Francisco Housing Action Coalition. In the sake of brevity, we share a lot of the same concerns regarding compliance with the state law. Based on what we're watching, I think we may have some of those answers and conversations here in a moment. But as somebody that's not an attorney, just kind of a plain reading of it, it does seem that we are potentially going to be outside of compliance for a long time. The city of San Francisco has been okay with that and operated as if it didn't really care, frankly, what the state of California was saying it needed to do, and we've had a shift with that over the last couple of years. We saw the battle with density bonuses. I think even today we saw another state density bonus project headed to SOMA, where we're not going to get the opportunity to use a local program that has more inclusionary housing. So more housing is always good, however we can get on, especially affordable by design, lowercase a affordable housing. We just want to make sure we are good to go according to the state of California. Thank you.
Afternoon, Jennifer Fieber from the San Francisco Tenants Union. I'm encouraged to hear the changes that Marcel spoke about, so I'm changing my testimony. You took the wind out of my sails. We had seen a lot of ADU permits that were violating the rights of existing tenants. The owners were using seismic work in ADUs to force tenants out for long periods of time and not compensating them and taking away services that were part of their leases. We hope that the discussions with the rent board over how the rent ordinance works continues. We had a case where under ADUs they were going to put an elevator through tenants' apartments, and the planning department staffer thought that that was fine. So for many tenants, they see some letters from the planning department and they trust what their landlords are saying, and they don't realize that their rights are different than what this official look of piece of paper is saying. So we would really encourage you to get tenants involved from the beginning. They do have rights and they should be included whenever they're going to be impacted. I still have questions about how ADUs, if approved, are going to take away services from tenants if they don't agree to that. That seems problematic. So we encourage you to keep working with tenant groups to explain the problem so we can all find a good solution. Thanks.
Good afternoon. Thank you for this opportunity to testify today. on these ADUs. My name is Kathy Lipscomb, and I work with Senior and Disability Action and the Tenants Union and other groups. I would add that certainly if a property owner has to displace a tenant, that that property owner is responsible for finding a comparable unit before the tenant is able to return to his or her apartment, and be responsible for any tenant housing costs incurred in the period of vacating. And thanks to Mrs. Brudeau, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, suggested a robust tracking mechanism for rental rates as more units become completed and are ready for occupancy. This becomes urgent, as it isn't 100% clear what units will be protected under rent control. We don't know that. And while displaced tenants return at the same rent, new tenants with or without rent control would start at market rates. We have to keep that in mind, that the landlord can charge whatever they want at the beginning of a new unit opening. So this would be prohibitively costly for most of us in the city. If that is the case, the ADU project does not adequately address low and moderate income renters, the city's majority. Lastly, in my District 8, there are approximately 198 total ADUs filed. Apparently, in an effort to streamline the process, the Planning Commission will not have oversight over any of this work, no matter what the size. This means neighbors and the public are largely left out of oversight as well. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Ozzie Rome with Noe Neighborhood Council. First of all, Supervisor Tang, I would like to thank you for taking off that amendment to allow ADU in new constructions. Of course, our concern was always regarding the demolition and whether or not the Planning Commission could reject demolition without putting the city at risk of lawsuit. So to the folks that are criticizing this move and the ones that are insisting that, we do need to allow ADUs in new construction, I understand, and I'm not against that, if we could have some sort of a compromise in the form of, well, ADUs should be probably rent controlled. ADUs could be below market rate. So if we would have some sort of a compromise, some give and take in that front, I could see something like this could happening. But if we're going to allow a demolition and the construction of a brand new ADU that is definitely not going to be rent controlled, obviously that's not going to be providing affordable housing. So that is one issue that you may want to look into. Another thing that I was going to bring up to your attention is for the past 3 weeks plus that we've been looking at this text, it keeps on confusing a whole bunch of activists because here it says the defined existing built envelope, which of course, as you know, is very much different than buildable envelope. So there has been a lot of confusion on that front, and I would appreciate it if you could reflect the actual intent of your legislation, which is no notification on existing unbuildable envelope. On that note, I would like to ask you to maintain notifications. That is so important. And in fact, if you have agreed to allow tenants to be notified, I would like to propose that landlords should show up with some sort of a proof as to who is paying for the PG&E. That is going to at least show who is living in the building, and that is going to make it easier to notify the inhabitants so that they're not going to get displaced. Thanks a lot.
Good afternoon, Supervisors. Christy Wong from SPUR. Thank you very much for the opportunity to weigh in on this new round of ADU legislation. We're very pleased to support this round of improvements. Since 2014, we've seen such a radical change in how people think about in-law units, which I find really incredible, and I think a great recognition of the housing shortage that we have and people really seeing that we need to do something about it. And this legislation builds on several of those prior efforts to address the barriers to constructing more of those in-law units in San Francisco. So we support the legislation as it was proposed. The Planning Department and Planning Commission have recommended several modifications, many of which we think do improve the legislation, but we are disappointed that the proposal to allow in-law units in new construction was removed from that. The fact that this new building could come back as soon as it's completed to add a new ADU, but at a much, much higher cost, doesn't really make a lot of sense, and it seems like there are other ways to navigate the legal issues and wanting to ensure that people are protected. Thank you very much for the opportunity to share our support. We appreciate that San Francisco is really clearly serious about making a dent in this housing shortage. Thanks.
Todd David on behalf of the San Francisco Housing Action Coalition. So a bunch of things that we've heard today, there's absolute agreement upon. I would say that I think it totally makes sense that if a tenant is had to leave their place in order to build an ADU, they absolutely, the owner of that should 100% be responsible for finding them comparable location and to pay any moving fees. I think that that is kind of best practice in the affordable housing world. I know that, for instance, I know that Mission Housing, that's a practice that they that they do, and I think that that makes sense. The other thing is that I totally think it makes sense that we do limit the size of ADUs. They are supposed to be accessory dwelling units. We don't want this to, I think it would be bad for the pro-housing world to say like, hey, we're going to try to figure out a workaround to add more density. Accessory dwelling units are supposed to be a smaller, granted affordable by design, and so I do think that having a maximum size and a minimum size, and maybe the maximum size is based on a percentage of the main house with a maximum, all that stuff makes sense. But I also do want to reiterate what Christy Wang said from Spur, that I am kind of missing what is the reasoning behind not allowing ADUs in brand new construction, right? I mean, it seems like there are a lot of different ways that the concerns that are out there can be addressed simply through a strong definition of what ADUs are, size, and affordable by design and things like that. So I do think that is a missed opportunity to not be immediately adding additional housing that once again would be affordable simply by its shape and size, and that seems to be a solution looking for a problem. I'm not sure why we are removing the ADUs from new construction. All right, thank you. Bye.
Good afternoon, Supervisors. Jeananne New, San Francisco Apartment Association, just calling out today to speak in favor of this legislation, in favor of increased ADU development, and also to lend our expertise, if needed, to resolve some of the complicated landlord-tenant issues around ADU development. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Rose. Coalition for San Francisco Neighborhoods submitted a letter on June 29th, and unfortunately I didn't see it in the packet of received letters, so I'm leaving it here. It's basically the opposition to the non-notification of ADUs into the required side yard, currently requiring 311 notification. Also, the neighbors advocated for pop-out notification, so that already went through. Anyway, I'll just leave this because it wasn't in the packet. The other thing is I communicated with planning staff, and I just wanted a clarification for the record. Legislation page 7, lines 8 through 12, about an ADU constructed entirely within the existing building envelope. And I asked about would the decks and cantilevered extensions be allowed in non-complying buildings? If the structure is legal non-conforming, she meant non-complying, yes. If it's not legal and non-complying, no. Ledge page 14, lines 3 to 4, I asked about standalone garage structure. Will the existing size restrictions for dormers remain? She said the existing design guidelines for dormers would still apply. Legislation page 18, lines 21 to 25, section 106A.4.9. Question, would a neighbor be allowed to ask for a pre-app meeting, or is it only the project sponsor? Planner responded, it is only the project applicant. That would be kind of problematic if neighbors are going to be involved as part of the process. As for my comment on ADUs, I know the size thing was removed, but ADUs with a 1,200 square foot size may not be distinguishable from a regular unit, and thus building projects can bypass the zoning for the parcel. Maybe that is one of the reasons for the removal of the ADUs from the new construction. It's about zoning. This would also occur when legalizing an unlimited number of ADUs on a property. In an executive summary, planning admits not being able to differentiate the ADUs from regular units. It was done in the 2016 Farrell-Wiener-Peskin legislation. Thank you. Please include this per Sunshine 67.16 into the minutes.
Thank you very much. Any other members of the public who wish to comment on item 2, please come on up. Seeing none, public comment is closed. So I did want to speak to a couple issues that I heard over and over again, and just want to make sure that we're very clear. We will have changes at the Board of Supervisors to correct language in the legislation, specifically as it relates to the built envelope. It actually should say the buildable area of an existing lot instead of saying built envelope or the buildable area of an existing building. Also, I heard comments about how we are allowing the expansion of ADUs within the buildable envelope without neighborhood notification. That's actually not true. And so just wanted to clarify that. And then when it comes to filling in and creating ADUs underneath cantilevered rooms and or decks and into the required rear yard, that will, per an amendment I'm actually going to make at the full Board of Supervisors. I just realized today, I can't make it here today, but I will be making that at the full board, that there will be a mandatory pre-app. So none of these things are contained in this legislation actually completely eliminates neighborhood notification. And if planning staff want to clarify any of that, please feel free to. But also, again, I think as Marcel Boudreau spoke to earlier around the tenants issues and removal of potential storage space, laundry space, or parking space, I think I would be very interested to see the outcome of your new internal process. I think that's really important. It's not something you'll see in this legislation, but I'm glad to hear that a new process has been implemented. So with that, Supervisor Safai.
Thank you, Chair Tang. So just a couple things that I've heard today I just want to clarify. I understand the reservations that folks have regarding the bullet number 11 regarding new construction, but it seems to me, just based on what I've heard, that could be easily taken care of by discussing it as new construction that didn't involve any demolition. So as there's a lot of vacant parcels in the city where you're building, so that and I know we've received some letters that we didn't want to actually encourage any demolition or displacement, that we could limit this, or I'm wondering if there's a way, if Planning Department wanted to talk about that, if there's a way that we could talk about this just in terms of new construction that didn't involve any demolition or displacement.
And I'll just add context really quickly as to why even remove that proposed amendment for creation of new ADUs within new construction is mostly because of what came up during Planning Commission. It was an argument related to the Housing Accountability Act and whether project sponsors could invoke that and say that they were, as of right, allowed to build a certain number of units. For me personally, I feel that the issues related to whether it's new construction that involved demolition of an existing unit versus just flat out new construction are very different.
Right.
We do have pretty strong demolition controls in our city that I think would account for some of the concerns that were raised. But in any case,
right, sometimes. But I understand that. There are a lot of cases where a building is not deemed significant, and you can get demolition or tantamount to demolition. And then you would have a situation where you're doing new construction or significant construction. So I understand the reasoning behind some of the letters that we received. We don't want to give an impetus for displacement or removal. But if you're just talking purely about new construction, it seems as though we could make an amendment that would limit these ADUs for new construction for 3 units or less that didn't involve any demolition or displacement. So did you want to comment on that? Because I'm a little confused as to what the reservation is.
I think I agree with Supervisor Tang. That was the reservation is overall around incentives for demolition, and that was kind of the majority of what the commission discussed. The idea of only allowing it for vacant lots also came up at the commission. Right. But at the end, it didn't get into a resolution, I think mostly because there was an agreement that this would be taken care of at a follow-up legislation that's around demolition. So it was discussed but didn't make it to the resolution. So they didn't make that recommendation.
Right. But they discussed it. So the fact that they discussed it, we could take action on that if we wanted to, correct?
I defer to the city attorney for that.
Deputy City Attorney John Givner. The board could amend, not today, because just with all the moving pieces, trying to minimize amendments on the floor. But that is an amendment that the board could consider either on Tuesday or in a future land use meeting.
Oh, so we could make it at the full board. Right, okay. Okay, and my second one is, and I've said a little bit about this, I would like to hear the rationale behind the removing the requirement for the street tree, because I know that we have a department now that is funded a little bit better in terms of street tree maintenance and overall new street tree expansion. And so I'm a little confused as to how that's being used as a rationale to slow down ADUs, because when you're submitting your plans for legalization or expansion, you would do that in parallel with the Bureau of Urban Forestry. So I would not be in support of removing that. I would be happy if you had them come out and say that it's not available because of the undergrounding, wiring, or so on. But just so we're clear for the record, doing it in lieu is more expensive than planting a tree.
Thank you.
So you'd want to allow, I mean, I would say for folks, you would want to leave that as an option to plant a tree if you can do it.
Thank you. So, Supervisor Safai, so yes, we're eliminating the requirement, but of course, if a project sponsor wants to do it, they absolutely can. And we're also giving them the ability for the in lieu fee, but we didn't just kind of pull this out of thin air.
No, I understand.
I think that mostly we had heard from a lot of different project sponsors as we were doing roundtables and focus groups about what was working and what was not in the ADU programs, and that came up a lot. So I do understand. I would love more trees in our city. My own landlord had an issue even with siting trees when he was trying to create ADUs too. So I know it's a very real problem. But I do know that, yes, moving forward, Public Works will be more well-staffed and hopefully it'll improve, but this is what we've been hearing as an issue.
I just would, for the record, tomorrow maybe we can invite Public Works to come and speak on it, because when I've spoken to them, they have said that they don't see that as an issue. It might have been an issue in the past. So I just want to say, first off, and I know I dove into the areas that I wanted to have, but I think this is a really great piece of legislation, Supervisor Tang. I know that there's a lot of folks out in the community, focus groups, planning department staff, otherwise, that have spent a lot of time thinking about this. I think this is forward thinking. I think there's some adjustments that could be made. I'm only harping on trees. I used to work at the Bureau of Urban Forestry. I'm a big proponent of adding more and more and more trees, and if we're going to be expanding in areas where we can add ADUs, which are probably more on the south and southwest part of San Francisco, there's a lot less trees there, so I would want to encourage that and continue to encourage that. So I would like to hear from the Department of Public Works and see what they have to say about this, and if they have some thoughts on whether or not this actually slows things down. I can see how maybe the undergrounding groups come out and kind of marking them up, but actually getting the plans approved, you do that kind of in parallel process. I'm not exactly sure that would be an impetus.
Okay, and again, just to clarify, and certainly we can definitely hear from Public Works, but just to clarify, we were originally proposing elimination of the street tree requirement,
No, I
but
understand.
now this amendment would say you either plant the tree or you could pay an in lieu fee. So somewhere in the city we will get a tree. Again, I totally hear your arguments about it could be more expensive and so forth, but
It is.
Yeah.
I just want to be clear. It is, to pay the in lieu fee, it is more expensive than planting the tree. So we might get into a situation where they pay the fee and then DPW comes back, because now the entire sidewalk is as you know, is the responsibility of the city in terms of planting trees. It's in the code. The city can come and plant the tree anyway. So
okay.
But go ahead. I'm sorry.
All right.
Did planning want to say something? Oh, okay.
Okay. Thank you, Supervisor Safai. Any other issues or?
No, just in terms of the neighborhood notification. So what we're saying is there's a mandatory pre-app just for the decks and
Filling in under
the
cantilevered rooms or decks.
But okay, and so the other areas, we're going to go with the administrative approval.
No. So the other areas, such as the expanding into the buildable area on an existing lot, those will still require the same neighborhood
So
notification.
expansion of existing legal non-conforming is the existing process?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
Okay, good. That was it. Those are the only questions I had at this moment.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, colleagues, any other questions, comments? Anything else to add from staff? Okay, thank you, and thanks to the public for all of their comments and helpful suggestions. So with that said, I wanted to make all the amendments that I had stated on the record, except I'm going to have to save the one regarding filling in under cantilevered rooms or decks, requiring a mandatory pre-app for the full board instead, as well as the cleanup on the buildable. I'm sorry, I can make that today? Oh, okay, great. So we can do that today. All right, so colleagues, can we get a motion on the amendments that I proposed then?
So move.
Okay, we'll do that without objection. Okay, and then a motion on the item as amended.
Motion to send this to the full board with positive recommendation as amended.
Okay, we'll do that without objection. Thank you, colleagues. All right, now, Madam Clerk, item 3, please.
Item number 3 is an ordinance amending the planning code to amend the Housing Opportunities Mean Equity San Francisco, otherwise known as HOME SF program, and affirming appropriate findings.
But they work for her. So
Thank you very much. Okay, so another piece of legislation before us here today. This one has to do with HOME SF. So as many of you know, for several years now, our office has worked with Planning Department, and I do want to thank, again, Menaka Mohan from my office and Paolo Ikezoe from Planning Department for their work on HOME SF, which is an optional program designed to really incentivize the creation of more affordable housing, especially for family-size units and for middle-income households. So since we've passed the legislation, about a year has passed, and we have seen that more project sponsors are opting to use the state density bonus law or the hybrid version. And so with that, we had to take a hard look at HOME SF and see what changes we could make so that we could make our local program a lot more attractive to project sponsors. And again, the hallmark of our legislation is around middle-income households as well as the bedroom sizes. So this is a pilot program where we're going to say that we'd like to make these changes, but then have the technical advisory committee study the new affordability rates as part of their reconvening after December 31st, 2019. So this is just, I don't want to call it an experiment, but it's a way for us to see if there are adjustments that we can make to HOME SF so that more developers might be incentivized to use this, because I do think that we do require 30% affordable housing on site versus the state law, which is either 12% for rentals or 20% for ownership. But we have heard challenges with meeting the 30% affordability rate. So we are proposing different tiers that project sponsors can opt into, depending on whether they take additional height increases or not. So with that said, I'm going to turn it over to Paolo Ikezoe from Planning Department then to go over this HOME SF 2.0 version.
Good afternoon, supervisors. I'm Paolo Ikezoe, Planning Department staff. So I'll just kind of briefly go through what the Planning Commission's recommendations were. So the Planning Commission considered this item at the June 28th hearing and recommended approval with the following proposed amendments. The first recommendation was to amend Section 206.3 D4 to allow HOME SF projects to receive all of the listed zoning modifications rather than just the 3 that are currently allowed. The Commission also recommended amending the affordability levels required in the proposed Tier 1 as follows. For projects of 24 units or fewer, requiring 20% on-site affordable HOME SF units at the proposed affordability levels, and for projects of 25 units or more, requiring 23% on-site affordable HOME SF units distributed at 10% at the lowest tier, 55 or 80% AMI, depending on renter, whether it's a rental or ownership unit, 8% at 80 or 105% AMI, and then an additional 5% at 110 or 130% AMI. The Commission recommended setting all affordability levels as maximums, so allowing project sponsors to provide units with deeper affordability and still qualify for the program. They also recommended a 180-day timeline for approval of HOME SF projects instead of the 120 days proposed, and recommended starting the clock on that timeline at the completion of environmental review. And finally, the Commission recommended including a use it or lose it provision requiring HOME SF project sponsors to file a building permit application within 2 years of entitlement. So that concludes my presentation of the Commission's recommendations, and I'm available for any questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So now I'm going to just go over the changes that we're making to Home SF and what recommendations we are taking or not. So as I mentioned, we are trying to create 3 different tiers for this program temporarily. So right now, developers have to provide 30% affordable housing on site if they want to opt into Home SF. Instead, we will be taking the Planning Commission recommendations around the tiers. So the first tier, if you have projects that are under 24 units or 24 units or less, then you could provide 20% affordable housing. And you get any zoning modifications. If you build over 24 units, then the affordability rate is 23%. The second tier that we're proposing, developers can add 1 additional story above existing height limits, and the affordability rate would be 25% on site. And then the third tier is if you take 2 stories above existing height limits, then you do need to provide the full 30% affordability. And for all the different tiers, we are saying that we would like to allow project sponsors any number, basically an unlimited number of zoning modifications. The state density bonus law allows up to 3 zoning modifications, and so we thought this might be one attractive way to bring people to be incentivized to use Home SF. Regarding the timeline for approvals, we thought it was really important for there to be some sort of certainty over project approvals. So we are actually, there's kind of a hybrid of the Planning Commission recommendation and what we originally proposed. And we are saying that we would like the timeline for approval to be 180 days for completion unless an EIR is required. We also wanted to ensure that Home SF provides affordability levels that are higher than the amount required by the inclusionary housing ordinance. So we do have a proposal in here for an amendment to just clarify that, because I know that was a concern raised by several community members that Home SF would somehow dip below what inclusionary requires for affordability. There is a change in terms of a new section in the planning code that we are going to have to kind of delete and reinstate because of the mayor's process improvement legislation. So that's more of a technical change that we have to make today. And then, of course, we are directing the Technical Advisory Committee to explore indexing Home SF rates similar to the inclusionary housing program. We stated that we wanted to make this change before, but we never included in the legislation. So now it's going to be in the legislation after committee. So those are the major changes that we're planning to make today in Land Use Committee, but happy to answer any questions or comments from colleagues. Supervisor Kim?
One of my questions was something that was brought up by some of our community advocates, which is why we're not tiering different inclusionary percentages based on whether the proposed project is building rentals or home ownership, which was part of our larger inclusionary ordinance, understanding that there's a little more value to home ownership. I think one of the concerns here is that the way Home SF 2.0 is built, it will incentivize just condo developments here on these parcels.
Thanks. That's a great question. And actually, the state density bonus law has different percentage requirements for affordability based on whether it's ownership or rentals. But the original Home SF never broke it out into that. We just simply had a pretty high level of affordability. So our change today, really, we were just trying to build on top of the Home SF. If we were to change into rental or ownership categories, that'd be a complete, I think, overhaul of the entire program, which, I mean, we're open to discussion, but we're just trying to kind of make little tweaks to Home SF, the first version, to see what we can do to make it more attractive.
Would that require some type of re-referral to planning? Is that
I believe so. That's an entire rewrite of Home SF in general.
Okay. I may press up on this later, but I just wanted to ask that question first.
Okay. Supervisor Safai?
I wanted to ask, just on the record, I kind of thought about this, and I know Supervisor Kim and I spent a lot of time working on inclusionary, and I know that I've worked with you on this Home SF, but I just wanted to just ask out loud and just see what the reaction was to the requirement on the 2 bedrooms, and I wanted to hear what Supervisor Kim had to say on that, since I can't talk to her about any of this until we're in the committee room. But one of the reasons why we're back here right now, and I know you probably said this, Supervisor Tang, when I left the room, but we've had this in effect for over a year, and pretty much nobody has taken advantage of it yet, and now we have the state density bonus law. People are beginning to file applications or invoking that. And so we're thinking about how we can take a step back and make this more attractive and more of an engine for development than the state density bonus law. And so one of the things that we've heard over and over again from folks is that the cost of construction, when you're dealing with additional floors, the type of construction changes. So the cost of construction accelerates, goes up. And so why would you want to do this program with the added affordability? And I think that's what we're trying to think about as well, the added affordability, the driver behind middle-class housing and workforce housing. So there's a lot of things that we're trying to wrap into this policy. But so I really like the idea of giving the tier system complete density decontrol, an additional floor with an additional level of affordability, and then the 2 full floors with the original required affordability. But another thing that we've heard from some folks in the development community, and again, we pushed hard for a minimum number of 3 bedrooms and 2 bedrooms, and that was at 25%, but this goes as high as 40%. And this is not meant to say we want more single, we want 1 bedrooms and studios, but having the flexibility, have a little bit more of a mix might engender people to take advantage of that. I just wanted to hear what Supervisor Kim had to say, because I know that if we were doing just complete density decontrol, you're at one level of affordability. Why not think about maybe having a slightly different requirement on the entire 40% 2 bedrooms? We're already at 25 on inclusionary with minimum 10% 3 bedrooms. So is there a way to think about the 2 bedroom requirement in the context of this tiered system? So I just wanted to hear what Supervisor Kim had to say to that.
Sorry, Supervisor Safi, what is the actual question?
So the question is, so we're doing a tier, sorry. So we have a tiered system now based on the number of density decontrol, 1, no additional floor, a higher level of affordability for 1 floor, the full level of affordability for 2 floors. And so what I was saying is, could we approach the bedroom count similar, where you'd have a tiered structure? So there's a floor already there at 25%. That's what we've set in our inclusionary conversation, where you have to have a 25% 2s and 3s with 10% 3s. So could you also have a tiered system on the 40% bedroom count for 2 bedrooms? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think I understand. So you're suggesting that we amend the percentages to have tiers based on
the unit mix. Yeah, the unit mix. If we could have it.
I'm not the author of this ordinance. I do support the 40% of new units to include 2 bedrooms, because I think part of if this is to target middle class households, and we are actually upping the levels of AMI to target 80 to 130%, I think that we should also keep high levels of 2 and 3 bedroom units in these middle class projects. So, I support it as is.
No, I get it. I guess what I was saying is, we're thinking about this in terms of different levels of affordability, but also in terms of impediments to construction. So you would get some more units in a different version, but you have a minimum of 25% 2 bedrooms. So I guess you could say on tier 1 you could go to 30%. I also want to hear obviously from the project sponsor, but I wanted to hear from you first because we had spent a lot of time going back and forth over the 2 bedrooms.
I just think that once we're targeting 80 to 130% of average median income, that we should really be looking at housing families and not individuals.
I agree.
And so I think keeping the 40% mix through, whether it's tier 1, 2, or 3, is what I would support.
Okay. Supervisor
Thank
Tang.
you. Thanks for that question. And I think there were two central hallmarks of Home SF, the first version, which was middle income housing and the family size units. And so I would have to agree with Supervisor Kim, and that's why I didn't propose a change to that bedroom mix, is we were actually, I think, one of the first programs to actually require such a high rate of 2 bedrooms. And I thought that was really important because if you look historically at what the city has built over the years, it's been studios and 1 bedrooms. And so we're trying to really change that here. But again, I know that this is an optional program and we're trying to make it more attractive. So I know you're just trying to figure out what barriers we can remove.
Yeah, no, and of course I know you're the project sponsor, but you and I have worked on this together, so we've had a lot of conversations before we were on the same committee. But what I'm saying is there is a project in my district right now that we're working on that's, that we're trying to get to be one of the first, ones that will take advantage of Home SF, and this is, we're hitting some roadblocks. And so is it worth, we're talking about smaller margins, is it instead of 40% 2 bedrooms, you got 35% 2 bedrooms? Would that be something that in the end of the day we get someone to have this higher level of affordability, and yet we still have 35%, 2s and 3s? I think that's what I'm really asking. But I mean, we spent a year on this program. We didn't get many applications, and I think we're taking a really good look at why we're adjusting it. And I think the tiered system for the floors and the affordability is a really big step. So I just wanted to throw it out there. If folks want to leave it at 40%, let's see where the dust settles. I'm fine with that too. I just wanted to put it out there because I think that I've heard from the sponsor that we're trying our best to get this to work. And when you're scaling maybe at 200 or 300 units, it's a different conversation than when you're in the 100 unit. So it might make that difference. That's all. Mm-hmm. But I get it.
Thank you. Yes, point well taken. And I think, this is a temporary change to Home SF. So perhaps when we're going to reevaluate this entire program in a year or so, that maybe we could take up all those different issues that were raised.
I just wanted to throw it out there, but I'm fine. And I think these are all great amendments. Thank you for your hard work on this.
Okay. Thank you. And if there are no other questions or comments or any further feedback from Planning Department, then I'll open up this item to public comment. Anyone would like to speak on item 3, please come on up. Okay. Wow. Really? Oh, okay.
Bang the gavel. I'm just kidding.
Good afternoon, supervisors. Peter Papadopoulos, Mission Economic Development Agency. And I want to thank Supervisor Tang, you and your office, for our discussions on this legislation. It's been very helpful. And I think I'm not 100% clear on what potential amendments are in play right now in some ways, but so I just want to stress a couple of things in that context of that I think maintaining whatever that these floors are that we have in the mission. I know the mission particularly intersects with this legislation in a different way than other neighborhoods, as well as the same in others. So just sort of making sure that we're maintaining a 25% affordability on each of the tiers of this program. Also making sure that we are maintaining our tiers of very low-income housing, particularly given the critical need for that very low-income housing we're having in the mission. So that 55 AMI housing we think is crucial, particularly in the context of making sure that we're actually seeing an improvement over the state density bonus outcome, which I think is what we're after here. It doesn't apply to that many units in the mission, to that many sites. Practically speaking, when you're saying 1.
It might be 1 soft site.
Because we were shown 13, I believe, which are sort of like lining right across the middle of a very crucial area right now that's seeing a lot of commercial and residential development. So yeah, it would be great if we could review what those sites are there. I do think that whether the conditional use or some option to have the ability to take an appeal to the supervisors is an important right that currently the neighborhoods have. We haven't found the Board of Appeals to have been a particularly significant avenue to redress concerns. So I would add that. Thank you.
Thank you, and I'll ask my staff to show you the map of the soft sites. Next speaker, please.
Good afternoon, supervisors. Carlos Bocanegra for Mission Neighborhood Centers, and I'm coming up, I guess, to essentially echo the comments that Peter was just making. I think that it's great that you're trying to make this program more attractive for developers to have them come into the program, but I think that there's a fine line between us being a city and us being a private corporation trying to incentivize business. I think that that line is drawn once we see a program that is going to create a greater detriment and have a far worse impact than I think was intention. And I'm speaking particularly to the Mission District, where we have that 25% affordability ratio. Once we create a program that's going to incentivize, attract more developers to come into the program, but that program is going to diminish what was achieved in the mission and diminish those affordability housing percentages. I know that this program is for middle-income residents, but I think low-income residents should be considered as well, and their ability to stay and live within San Francisco and the mission as well should be something that should be considered. So I think having an amendment to preserve what was already a long and thoughtful process of getting to 25% within the mission and looking at that in other neighborhoods as well, and making sure that we're not just painting a broad brush, that we're looking at each district, each of the unique affordability housing percentages, and making sure that we're at least meeting the bar for each of those neighborhoods, because the minute that we're taking that bar and moving it lower just to bring development is the minute that we should really do a hard introspection and realize that we're doing something wrong. So I think in terms of this legislation, if there could be amendments to the legislation to protect places like the mission that have higher affordability percentages at lower AMIs, and protecting low-income citizens as well as middle-income citizens, that we'd be doing ourselves a great service. Thank you.
Good afternoon again, Supervisors. Corey Smith on behalf of the San Francisco Housing Action Coalition. Generally supportive, but a few amendments we would like to see included in this. Number one, we request that we eliminate all conditional use requirements altogether. At this point in time, San Francisco, all housing is necessary and desirable, especially housing that is dense along transit corridors with more affordable housing on site. We also want to do what we can to be supporting commercial corridors. We know that commercial corridors across the city do need a lot more density, therefore requesting that we get rid of all demolition controls. There's a number of opportunity sites where there is ground floor retail with 1 or 2 residential units above, and we'd be able to open up a lot more housing, a lot more homes for people if we were able to capitalize on those opportunities. There are plenty of strong right to return and moving fees that can be included to make sure that nobody is getting evicted or displaced, and a lot of those best practices are used all the time up at the state level. We also think that it should be city policy to encourage the highest density options that are available under current zoning laws, especially when it comes to 100% subsidized affordable housing. The McDonald's site in my neighborhood comes to mind on that, because the preferred and alternative options are 5 and 7 stories. And again, we're talking about 100% affordable housing, where the current zoning allows us to go up to 8 stories. I think we always should be maximizing opportunities whenever we can get as much BMR available. Anything related to the Technical Advisory Committee, we understand that this group is appointed, but they are either politically motivated or politically influenced. So we want to try to find opportunities to get the politics out of housing development whenever possible. One of the easy examples, the Technical Advisory Committee came back with an 14 to 18% range on the basic inclusionary, and that means we start at 18, where logic would have us start at 16, which would be the very middle. And then lastly, one of the real benefits to the state program is legal protections against appeals, and that does not exist in the local program. So we would like that added as well. Again, we want to incentivize this over the state program, and think these amendments would help. Thank you.
Hi, Supervisors. Christy Wong from Spur. Thanks for the opportunity to weigh in on this proposal to amend Home SF and the 100% affordable housing bonus programs. We've strongly supported this program since Supervisor Tang first introduced it in 2015. And we think, we believe that the intention has always been for Home SF to be an attractive local option to the state density bonus and other programs. Unfortunately, there's been a lack of demand for the program. Perhaps it's due to the affordability requirements or maybe the extensive list of eligibility requirements. The examples in the staff report that included 4 projects that had filed applications or revised applications are really instructive. Home SF would create 172 units instead of 78 units overall, and it would create 52 affordable units instead of 6 affordable units and an in lieu fee. Clearly, if more projects selected Home SF, the impact could be very meaningful. But a number of projects in these eligible areas passed up Home SF and chose the state density bonus or didn't use one at all. So we support the effort to offer a temporary pilot option with tiered affordability and commensurate benefits, though we are concerned that the feasibility is still risky at the proposed levels coming out of the Planning Commission. It's a great idea to learn from experience and data. We support setting a limited time frame for approvals and the proposed process changes. And we also support the Planning Department's recommendation to eliminate the limit on the number of zoning modifications allowed. Overall, we appreciate the intention of this legislation and hope that the city will continue to monitor and adjust into the future. Thanks.
Good afternoon, Supervisors. Peter Cohen with the Council of Community Housing Organizations. I just wanted to give us a little context about this choice developers are making. About this time last year, as you all know, because you were sponsors of both, Home SF and Inclusionary were adopted kind of as a pair, and there were a lot of work by our organizations and others to get them to sort of mirror each other so they weren't competing against each other. So there was a level setting. What happened simultaneously is Assemblymember Phil Ting at the state level was trying to true up through a state bill our local inclusionary so it wouldn't be impacted negatively by state density bonus. And unfortunately that bill lost, as you also know. And that's the experience we've now had for the last year, is that state density bonus is without question not only more attractive than Home SF, but it actually undermines our local inclusionary policy. So developers are actually reducing their inclusionary units compared to the local inclusion. That's still a fix we haven't been able to solve. So it is a frustrating situation that there needs to be these adjustments to Home SF in order to sort of lower the requirements to meet state density bonus, but that is where we are as a city and local policymakers. It's just a cautionary tale, if we will, about what can happen at the state that can impact us locally. The Planning Commission had a couple of recommendations, which we think are very smart as far as policy. One, you've mentioned to have indexing, annual indexing that mirrors inclusionary. There's no reason to not start that now, but if you want to wait, it just seems like it's something that should be equal to inclusionary along the way with that 0.5 increase each year. Secondly was a requirement that construction and entitlements actually have an expiration date. So we're motivating developers who get the benefits of the local policy to actually build the units, a so-called use it or lose it policy of a couple of years, perhaps an extension. And lastly, there's some work around 100% affordable projects that we think needs to be tweaked, and we can help you with language on any of those three amendments if you'd like to work with our office. We'd be happy to help. Thank you, Supervisors.
Hi, good afternoon. Eric Adway with Calle 24. I just want to first say thank you for the work that you're doing around affordable housing. One thing that I do want to mention, when Calle 24 first formed, we did extensive outreach to our community. We reached out to about 4,000 in the neighborhood. And this included businesses, homeowners, renters, artists, youth, just everyone that makes up the neighborhood and the mission. And one thing that we heard constantly was affordability. Over and over again, affordability in renting commercial spaces or in just housing in general. One thing that we're concerned about is making sure that we maintain the affordability for those folks making or at 55 AMI and maintaining the current percentage at 15%. I think any lower will be detrimental to the Latino community. The mission has been completely decimated in the last couple of years as far as the displacement that's happening in the city with gentrification. So we want to make sure that these families that are making an average of $44,000 a year for a family of four are able to stay. This is they're our most vulnerable population, and their safety nets have been removed. So that's where we're seeing a lot of these folks become homeless, living in cars. We even know families that are taking baths in nonprofits in the mission. So that's how drastic it has been. So hopefully you can keep that in mind. You know, every neighborhood is very different economically. The population is different, and we have to make sure that the mission is protected. Thank you.
Good afternoon again. Ozzie Brown with Noe Neighborhood Council. Yes, I believe that providing these three different tiers would definitely entice development community to actually take advantage of HomeSF, and maybe there are there's going to be more affordable units created using the tiered solution. Now, here's one criticism that I have of this program, and that is the removal of the conditional use authorization. Commissioner Hillis, President Hillis actually himself, as early as a couple of weeks ago, was saying that they've yet to see a HomeSF project at the Planning Commission. So it doesn't look like that the Planning Commission is a stopping block for people to bring HomeSF projects online, because there are plenty of developers that do the state density bonus, still go through the Planning Commission, and they're not terrified of showing up before the commissioners. So I think I would appreciate it if you maintain the conditional use authorization for all tiers of HomeSF projects. And to second what Mr. Cohen says, use it or lose it is very important. It's not only because that is going to entice people, developers that get their entitlements, to get busy and build it, but it's also going to dampen the speculative behavior in the development community, and in general, what has fueled to the fire of affordability crisis that we're facing. One last thing that I would like to request, I know it came up at the Planning Commission, and that is the map of the eligible sites, particularly now that myself in Noe Valley, we are faced with a possibility of a site of Real Foods that might actually become available. Well, it is available now for construction of just.
Ma'am, that's your time. I think your time.
Oh, sorry, I didn't hear the ding. Okay, sorry, I apologize. Everyone has 2 minutes. So.
Oh, I'm sorry.
But if you want to submit anything, you can submit it to us.
Okay. I just wanted to mention that we would appreciate if the planning department would give us the sites of eligible sites throughout the city, because I think the map exists, but it's very hard to get.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Kevin. I'm with the Latino Democratic Club and housing activist whenever I can find time. Also, happy birthday to Supervisor Jane Kim. I wanted to speak a little bit on HomeSF 2.0 and some of the modifications that came into play. So right now, we've done a lot of hard work in the Mission District, starting with Prop I way back in 2015. And, we've had the MAP 2020 planning process that's actually come out of that. So we're really just looking for an equitable outcome in the Mission, and we need to make sure that at least 25% affordable is required for Mission at all tiers of HomeSF, and especially at the lowest tier when it comes to 55% of AMI. I definitely like what was said as well, and I'd like to echo out that we should definitely keep conditional use for all tiers as well, because it seems that we very rarely have a HomeSF project come through the Planning Commission. Also, speeding up the project so that way we incentivize developers to use it or lose it is also a great policy that we should probably implement, so that way they're not holding on to projects and just doing the 2 years out and then just keep extending it out. And we also need to include some level of very low income affordable housing as a traditional development of the state density bonus development in the Mission. There's a major concern with all allowed unlimited modification concerns. The map that we saw actually shows that we have 13 sites that are developable, specifically down the 20th Street range. We have Bite Unite, which is coming, which is a startup project that's coming for cooking. They're like $300-$400 classes. Taboni's project on 20th and South Van Nuts, which has 75 units. They use the state density bonus. Lingerie, which is high-class coffee shop. And so specifically the one that's a major concern is actually right in the middle of our Latino cultural district, and 24th and South Van Nuys, right where we have two murals that actually depict Carnival. And so we need to really protect that area. So thank you for your time.
Hello again, Brett Gladstone, Land Use Attorney. I just want to speak to the use it or lose it. It's been 10 years since our Great Recession of 2008, so we're beginning to perhaps forget about it. But the economy can crash very quickly. It doesn't go back to normal very quickly. I remember the days after 2008 when the planning department would call people like myself and say, please, where are your clients' projects? Please bring them in. And there was legislation to entice people to build their projects. That could happen again, and I'm afraid I haven't read the use it or lose it provision, But if it provides it's automatic and that it's not through a vote of the Planning Commission, that is, if the revocation is not through a hearing at the Planning Commission, I really believe that's important. Forgive me if it's already in there. And I do ask that you consider making it longer. Again, when the economy goes, it doesn't come back very fast. There are very few reasons a developer would just hold on to things. The issue is usually cannot find the investors, or can find the investors and cannot find the loans, or find the loans but the interest rates have gone too high, or the amount of equity required of the developer is too high. So I would like to hear back as to how that's written, and I urge you to consider giving that a little more time. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Any other members of the public who wish to comment on item 3? Okay, seeing none, public comment is closed. Just to address a couple of things, we actually don't have a provision to, we're not planning to adopt the Planning Commission recommendation around the use it or lose it provision. Currently, entitlements already have a 3-year time frame, and so I think if project sponsors don't create something within that time frame, they have to reapply. And so I think, or is that reapply or go through another hearing? Does the planning department want to weigh in? And so I think what we're hearing from the community is they wanted it shortened by 1 year. At this time, I'm not planning on making that change, but maybe you could speak to what the current process is.
Yes, so they do, entitlements do expire, and so currently I think projects, they have to basically come back and ask for an extension, but it's not automatic.
Yeah, slight correction. They don't actually expire, and it's not automatic. After 3 years, the planning department and the planning commission can revoke permits if they haven't been started to build, but it's not something that happens automatically. And if they're still making due diligence to try to pursue their project, then we usually don't institute something until they stop making due diligence and we feel it's totally stalled.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. The other thing is I heard a lot of comments from individuals from the mission community. A lot of the mission is off limits to Home SF, mostly because neighborhood commercial transit corridors are excluded. The mission, I guess, mostly comprised of urban mixed use zoning is also not part of or does not qualify for Home SF. So I just wanted to reassure the community about that. Also, I heard a lot of comments about eliminating the CU requirement for the different tiers. That's not something we're doing, so I'm not sure where that came from. It's still the same approval process. It still has to go through a planning commission hearing for all the different tiers, just like it was before. So I don't know if planning staff, if you want to speak more on the mission area, again, just because we heard so many comments and concerns about that, I'm looking at the map as well. I don't see how Home SF really, a lot of it applies to the district.
Sure. Paulo Ikezoi with Planning Department staff. So much of the mission was rezoned as part of the Eastern neighborhoods. And so much of the mission's zoning is density decontrolled. So it's the specific type of zoning that does not allow, that where Home SF is not allowed. Also, Home SF is not allowed on any parcel where there is an existing residential unit, and so that takes out the vast majority of units across the city, but in the mission especially. And so there are some parcels within the mission that were not rezoned as part of the area plan, and so those parcels, if there is no housing on them, could potentially be eligible for Home SF, but largely the vast majority of the neighborhood is not eligible for Home SF.
Okay, so just to reiterate, as part of the original Home SF program, area plans were excluded, as well as NCTs, neighborhood commercial transit corridors. So, and then on top of that, all the restrictions around no demolition of units that have existing rental units there. So again, a large, if not the vast majority of the mission is not eligible for Home SF. So with that, colleagues, do we have any other questions or comments before we formally adopt any amendments?
No?
Okay. So if we can get a motion on the amendments that I propose. I also forgot to mention one part, which is that for the 100% affordable housing program, we no longer have to make amendments about this because it was part of the mayor's process improvements legislation. Okay,
Great.
Supervisor Kim?
Thank you. I want to thank Supervisor Tang for working on the revamping of this pilot program. And I do want some consideration around different levels for rentals and home ownership, but out of respect for the process thus far, I'm happy to support this out of Land Use Committee today. I do understand that the TAC will be studying this proposal and will be looking at how we should appropriately tier. I didn't understand the big difference between a 2-year versus a 3-year use it or lose it amendment, so I'm happy to support the 3 years. Finally, I'm happy to see that there is, although this was a discussion, a strong requirement around 2 and 3 bedrooms, which we know that we need to see more of being produced throughout the city. And, I'm looking forward to what, if this does incentivize developers to look at the Home SF program. It wasn't clear to me exactly what amendments were being proposed for the 100% affordable. And if all of those were actually taken care of by the separate ordinance on the planning approvals. But since we have a little bit of time before the board meeting next Tuesday, I'll kind of wait to hear and see and make sure that there's alignment around a number of the different asks there. But thank you, Supervisor Tang, for your work on this.
Thank you. Originally, we were going to add in our legislation that 100% affordable home SF projects would no longer be subject to a planning commission hearing and could be approved by the director of planning. That provision was taken care of in the previous legislation that the mayor's process improvements that we passed already out of committee.
And just point of clarification, do these amendments require us to hear this at the following meeting, or can we send this to the full board?
Per our deputy city attorney's nodding his head, we can send it to the full board.
Okay, great.
Okay, so if we can get a motion on the amendments first.
I'll make a motion to approve the amendments as proposed.
Okay, and then on the item as amended.
So Supervisor, you want to do it? Okay, so propose to send this item as amended to the full board as a committee report.
With positive recommendation.
With positive recommendation.
Thank you very much. All right. And next, items 4 and 5, please. Thank you, colleagues.
Item number 4 is an ordinance ordering the summary street vacation of a portion of Burnett Avenue North, generally bounded by assessor parcels block number 2719C, assessor's parcel block number 2745. And item number 5 is an ordinance amending the planning code by revising zoning map sheet ZN06 to rezone assessor's parcel block number AB 2719C, lot number 023, located at Burnett Avenue and Burnett Avenue North.
Thank you. And with that, I'll have a representative from Supervisor Sheehy's office, and we will have to correct something from a previous item later. Sorry. Go ahead.
Good afternoon, Chair Tang, members of the committee, Marty Fatu, Office Supervisor Jeff Sheehy. Our office is in full support of the zoning amendment as well as the summary vacation. As well, we have Audrey Butkus from the Planning Department to answer any questions, as well as Mr. Capra from the City Attorneys. Rob here? No? Okay. And then we also have Mr. Kevin Birmingham, who is the property owner, to answer any clarifying questions that you may have as well. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Supervisors. Audrey Butkus from the Planning Department. Here to just give you an idea of what happened at the Planning Commission. The Commission originally heard this item on December 21st in 2017. At that hearing, 3 members of the public spoke against the proposed rezoning, and 1 member of the public requested that Copper Alley also be extended to connect Burnett Avenue as part of the rezoning and settlement. The Commission voted to continue the item in order to better understand the potential development scenarios that would be possible if the ordinance was approved. The Planning Commission heard this item again on January 18th of this year and were presented with the potential development scenarios if the ordinance was approved. After hearing the development scenarios, the Commission voted unanimously to approve the ordinance, and I'm also available for any questions. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Colleagues, okay, I guess we'll have a presentation first.
Hi, my name is Gary Russ. I'm the president of the Burnett Terrace Condominium Association.
Hold on one second. I'm sorry. I'll call you up during public comment, but are there no other kind of staff presentations? Okay, then I will open this up to public comment, and you may proceed.
No, I'm
Thank
still
you.
Gary Russ. The reason this is on the agenda at all involves a lawsuit that took place between developer George Birmingham, the city, and our homeowners association. I want to start by saying that our HOA is fully endorsing this resolution, which has been very long in coming. Secondly, I want to, there's a detail in this that is worth addressing now. We refer to this as Burnett Avenue North. This land is not on Burnett Avenue North. The land is part of a piece of land owned by the city on which you'll find a street called Old Burnett Avenue, not Burnett Avenue North. And the reason for that is if this is ever approved, it's going to be confused with our street, which is Burnett Avenue North. And their driveway and their access to that land will have nothing to do with ours. It will be confusing. And it's currently very confusing as it is because our street intersects directly onto Burnett Avenue. So a lot of our mail and our visitors and packages are constantly being redirected to the wrong place. So I'm just pointing out, we talk about this being Burnett Avenue North, but it isn't. It's Old Burnett. That's the street to be vacated. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Any other members of the public who wish to comment on these items, 4 and 5? Okay, seeing none, public comment is closed. All right, and I also understand that there will be legislation following in GAO and the Government Audit and Oversight Committee as well, and this is kind of a long time issue that I'm happy to see that there was a settlement. Colleagues, any questions, comments? Okay, seeing none, can we get a motion on items 4 and 5? Items 4 and 5.
So move.
Okay, we'll send this out as a committee report to the full board, both items 4 and 5 as a committee report, and we'll do that without objection. Okay, thank you very much. And colleagues, I apologize, but we need to just go back to item 3 just because it was not supposed to go as, well, item 3 should not be sent out as a committee report, first of all.
Oh, I noted it as you say. It was recorded as not as a committee report.
Okay, great. Thank you. So, colleagues, can we rescind the vote for item 2 only because we actually need to duplicate the file and then keep the building code portion in land use for follow-up amendments, specifically as it relates to the pre-application meeting requirements?
Yes.
Okay. Motion to rescind?
I'll make the motion.
Thank you. And item 2, if we can, again, I would like to duplicate the file, keep the building code portion in land use committee to the call of the chair, and then we'll send out the other one as amended to the full board with positive recommendation.
Second.
Okay. We'll do that without objection. Thank you. Okay. Items 6 through 8, please.
Item number 6 is an ordinance amending the general plan by adding the central south of Market area plan, generally bounded on its western portion by 6th Street, on its eastern portion by 2nd Street, on its northern portion by the border of the downtown plan area, and on its southern portion by Townsend Street, and making conforming amendments to the commerce and industry element and housing element, urban design element, land use index, and the East SOMA and West SOMA area plans, and making appropriate findings. Item number 7 is an ordinance amending the zoning map of the planning code to create the central south of Market special use district and making other amendments to the height bulk district maps and zoning use district maps consistent with the central SOMA area plan and making appropriate findings. Item number 8 is an ordinance amending the business and tax regulations and planning codes to create the central south of Market housing sustainability district.
Thank you. Supervisor Kim.
Thank you, Supervisor Tang, or Chair Tang. I will be extremely brief because of some procedural issues. We are not actually going to be hearing this item today, but we'll be hearing it next Monday, July 16th. Because it's been agendized, we do have to allow time for members of the public to come and speak. For those that did not come, we did ask people not to come speak today because we are not truly hearing this item. But I do see members of the public here, but if folks are worried that they didn't come and say
speak their mind on this area plan, no worries. The real hearing is going to be next week, where we will be making a series of amendments and having a serious presentation and discussion on these items. I do want to acknowledge that the planning department is here. Both Lisa Chen, Anne Marie Rogers, Josh Twisky, as well as other members of the planning department. I want to appreciate you all being here today. And our staff in my office is working very closely with this team to get Central Soma up and ready for next Monday's hearing. We will have a very long series of amendments that our office will be proposing, and we're currently working through all of those right now. Sorry that we will not be able to do that here today. Madam Chair, I would just ask that we open up for public comment on these items, and I don't know if Planning Department wanted to say a few words before we open up for public comment. Okay, all right. All right, public comment is closed on item 6 through 8. Open on item 6 through 8. I apologize. Any members of the public who would like to speak on item 6 through 8? Last call. Okay, we'll see you next week. Public comment is closed. All right, so with that, Madam Clerk, are there any other items before us today?
There's no further business.
Okay, this meeting is adjourned.
Ooh.